you become sort of a personality vis-a-vis Nixon. In other words, you and Nixon get matched in the media.
I never
When did
intended
that
for that to
start?
happen. I never intended that to
How
happen,
did
but it
that
did
start?
happen.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know, I have a clip somewhere of, I think it was a Florida newspaper. It was not an uncommon thing, the reporter, Nixon learns to hate or loves to hate or something.
Right. You
I never intended for that to happen. I was never comfortable with it happening, and I was concerned about it. And I talked to my bureau chief, Bill Small, about it. And, his basic thing is, listen, when you're on television every night and you're the chief White House correspondent and you're doing your job, a certain amount of this is inevitable. The thing is, seed it out as much as you can. Don't pay any attention to it. Just do your work. What I didn't know for a while is they were pressuring him. A high-ranking Nixon administration official take the bureau chief to lunch. They have a nice wine-filled lunch, and at some point he says, we really like CBS. We really like you, but you have this hard-ass Rather over there, and, it's a problem for you. To Bill Small's credit, and it's worth putting on the record, that he shielded me from that. I didn't even know about it for quite a while. And then when it became pretty apparent they put it on, he basically said, don't worry about it. I got your back. You do your job. And I think this happened with other reporters as well.
Do you think there was any one particular incident that set them on fire, and
No.
then from then on
I don't.
it was
And
down?
I don't think it was a case of being set on fire. Well, I think they eventually became a flame, if you will. But I think it came slowly.
Okay.
Look, I'd like to think that it was, they said to themselves, how do I say this? This guy's a little harder to convince than some, and particularly television. A number of newspaper people who were really terrific, a hell of a lot better than I ever was. But I think, number one, I was on regularly. CBS Evening News, White House correspondent, was on regularly. So one, I was on regularly. Two, I'd been there a long time. By the time they got there, I was already a pretty experienced White House television correspondent, and yes, maybe fairly well known. And then, I tried my best for my banner to be, I don't buy and I can't be bought. I'm here trying to be an honest broker of information. And their thing is that's not what they want, and understandable. And the longer we went where they couldn't get what they wanted out of me or CBS, it started as small smoldering kind of spark, like you start a campfire. Then it began to get hotter and hotter.
Well, let's talk about one of the fires. Let's go to Houston in 1974.
Well,
Talk about that famous
Well,
incident.
in 1974, by 1974, responsibility for the widespread criminal conspiracy that was led to a degree out of the Oval Office itself, something that I never wanted to believe. In the beginning, I almost missed the story because not wanting to believe it, I just couldn't believe it was true. But by 1974, the record, the evidence and testimony that the special prosecutor by that time, Leon Jaworski, remember President Nixon had kicked out two before that, but Leon Jaworski was beginning to compile, and it was being made public, the contrast between the record of what had happened and what the president was saying was happening. It was widening. It was a widening gap. And President Nixon began to feel whatever metaphor you want to use. The noose was tightening. The corner was growing smaller. The special prosecutor was beginning to close in. First it was, well, the Watergate burglary was just a third-rate burglary. Didn't have anything to do with us. Then it was, well, some low campaign operatives. And they tossed over Jeb Magruder, thinking, well, that'll end there. Well, that didn't end. So then, it wasn't anything at the White House. It was John Mitchell and some other people outside. But by this time in 1974, the president was also already at the point where he'd had to, by the way, Vice President Spiro Agnew had fallen aside well before that. Incredible that the Vice President of the United States was forced out under very clouded circumstances. But anyway, by 1974, even Haldeman and Ehrlichman had been, in his desperate effort to keep throwing things over and people over the side to save the president, it was all closing on him. And the president and those who advised him set up what I would call a showcase alleged news conference in Houston. And it was for the sole purpose of getting the press on stage. I almost didn't go because they were going to put us on a stage. They had it was in the big arena. They had papered the arena, that is to say, gotten supporters to come in. Not all of them were, but many of them were. And the whole idea was to use the press as props and use this to be a campaign rally for a rally for President Nixon. And that was the atmosphere. There was talk in the press room of, should we even be a part of this? Because it's the first time I'm up on a stage, up on seats. Everybody knew it was a campaign rally. I said, well, listen, why should we independent reporters be a part of this? Have them hire reporters, which they'd done before, so campaign commercials. But there was, not everybody felt that way. Some did. But we finally decided to go. And we got there, and it was about what we expected. And I can't say each and every one of us, but many of us, including many of my competitors in television, people like Tom Gerald of ABC, Tom Brokaw of NBC, we were determined to have it be a real press conference rather than a pretend-to-be press conference. So a guy named Ray Miller with NBC in Houston, a very well-known news director and a good one, KPRC, was to be calling on the reporters. And in the early stages of the news conference is sometimes a little slow to start. There had been some questions, but nobody was, really pressing him. And Ray Miller pointed at me, and by that time, I'd become known for what I was, somebody who tried to ask tough questions at news conferences. And there have been several other incidents before this in which the president had tried to use a little technique of just throwing you off a little off balance, beginning, for example, San Clemente, California, some months before this. I'd said, Mr. President, I want to ask this question respectfully but directly. And he said, well, that would be unusual. It was part of trying to keep you off balance, being what I talked about before, being on the offense all the time. So when Miller pointed to me, I thought he was pointing to somebody else. I guess, truth to tell, I kind of hoped he was pointing to somebody else. But he said, So I got up. And in the atmosphere, it's hard to recreate the atmosphere. But you have a president of the United States who is beginning to face very serious accusations in which members of his own party, people who supported him for a long time, were saying, we want to know the truth. And the truth, as we've already found it out, does not look good for this president. So what I wanted to do is get up and ask a question, a direct question. The question, which I did get finally to ask, was, the special prosecutor has this evidence and testimony that points in one direction, and you keep telling us that's not true. How do we reconcile these two things? But when I got up, it was, I think, fair to say, a mixture of boos and maybe, there was some scattered applause. Houston's my hometown. I grew up there, was in radio there and television there for years.
But I mean, this is before you could even ask the question.
That's right. So I walked to the microphone. And it's fair to say that they were mostly boos. It was mixed, but mostly boos. And it didn't surprise me. As I say, it was kind of a stacked house in many ways. But my goal was to get up in front of the microphone, and as I always did, you identify yourself, Mr. President, Dan Rather, CBS News. Then he jumped in and said, well, are you running for something? Referring to the noise. Now, all of this happens in nanoseconds. I knew what it was. So, jab, trying to just take my concentration off, make me a little uneasy. He tried it before, not only with me, but with others, fair to say, a few times with me. And so I wanted to be respectful, and I wanted to get the question. So I said, no, sir, Mr. President, are you? And then that got a little response from the crowd, and then I asked my question. But there are no complaints. I don't have any complaints. But nobody ever remembers the question, which was what I described.
Mm-hmm.
How do you reconcile what you say with what the known record is becoming? Everybody remembers that little tete-a-tete.